The night train slid out of Dalian like it didn't want to be noticed, steel wheels whispering instead of shouting, the kind of sound that settles into your bones after a while. And Takase Jirō felt it as he stood near the center car, one hand on the leather strap, coat buttoned high, eyes moving without rushing, because trains always told the truth if you let them talk. The cars were warm but not cozy, lantern light swaying gently, throwing long shadows that made people look thinner. More nervous, and you could read a lot just from how someone held themselves, like Kurosawa Eiichi, the accountant-looking guy with the stiff back and restless fingers, already on his third cigarette since departure, tapping ash too often, glancing down the corridor as if someone might be counting his steps. The stewardess, Morita Aki, passed through with practiced calm, chin up, shoulders tight, memorizing faces the way only someone ignored for a living learns to do, while the conductor's boots clicked like punctuation marks, firm and final, rules walking on leather soles. Outside the windows, snow swallowed everything, flat land stretching into nothing, the kind of dark that made you believe this train was the only real thing left in the world. And that belief mattered, because when Kurosawa muttered something polite and stepped into the narrow vestibule between cars, cigarette already lit, nobody stopped him. Why would they? People smoked there all the time. It was normal, routine, harmless, just a man stealing a breath away from watchful eyes. Takase noticed anyway, because Kurosawa didn't relax when he exhaled. His shoulders stayed tight, like he was waiting for bad news. And when the metal door slid shut behind him, the sound lingered a second too long, sharp in the steady rhythm of the rails. Minutes passed. The train leaned into a long curve, slowing just a touch the way it always did on that stretch. And someone laughed too loud down the car, and someone else snored, and the world kept going. But Kurosawa didn't come back, and that was the first wrong thing. Small, easy to excuse, until Morita frowned and checked the time, until the conductor did a pass and noticed the gap where a man should be, until Takase felt that familiar, cold click in his head, where logic locks into place and refuses to let go. Because trains didn't lose people. Not like this. Not without a sound. Not without a stop. And as the snow kept falling and the night train pushed forward, sealed tight, full of breathing passengers, one empty space began to weigh more than any body ever could. By the time the conductor realized Kurosawa hadn't come back, the train had already settled into its night rhythm. That steady clack-clack that makes people assume everything's fine. And that's exactly what bothered Takase, because systems don't hide mistakes. People do. So he moved fast, not loud, slipping past knees and coats, eyes scanning the floor, the doors, the little habits of travelers who suddenly didn't know where to look. Morita Aki was already there at the vestibule. Standing too straight, hands folded tight at her waist, staring at the narrow space like it might answer her if she waited long enough. And when Takase asked how long Kurosawa had been out, she answered without blinking. 10 minutes, maybe more. And that alone told him she'd been counting. The metal between the cars was cold enough to bite through leather. Ash scattered near the rail, fresh, still grey, and the cigarette butt rested where it had been stubbed out on purpose, not dropped. Which meant Kurosawa had time, or at least believed he did. The outer doors were sealed, handles locked, ice crusted along the edges, no sign anyone had forced them. And Takase crouched low, running his fingers along the floor plates, checking gaps, screws, anything out of place. While the conductor hovered behind him, sweating under his cap, repeating that no stops were scheduled, no signals pulled, no exceptions. his voice sharp like he was trying to cut the idea out of the air. Passengers started to gather despite orders, curiosity louder than rules, the drunk journalist slurring that he'd heard footsteps earlier, pacing, nervous pacing, while a military officer watched from his seat without moving, eyes calm, too calm, measuring the scene like inventory. Takase asked questions fast and simple. Who saw him last? Who heard what? Who smelled smoke? And answers came messy but useful. Fragments that didn't agree, which was good because lies tend to line up too neatly. Morita pointed out something small most people missed, that Kurosawa always smoked with his case hooked to his wrist. But now the chain wasn't here, and that made the absence louder than any shout, because people don't leave what they're afraid to lose unless they plan to come back. Takase stood, dusted his hands, and looked down the length of the train, every door closed, every window fogged with breath, the snow outside blurring speed into stillness, and that's when it hit him. Not panic, not fear, just that quiet, heavy certainty that no one had fallen, no one had jumped, because the train hadn't swallowed a man. It was still holding him somewhere, hidden in plain sight, and as the conductor ordered a car-by-car check, Takase followed, already thinking less about where Kurosawa went, and more about why he'd chosen the cold, narrow space between cars to start disappearing. The first thing Takase did was stop everyone from guessing, because guessing spreads faster than facts, and on a train that couldn't stop, that was dangerous. So he asked the conductor to lock down the rules instead. No doors opened after departure, no stops between stations, no exceptions unless the engine itself failed, and Hayashi recited them stiff-backed like scripture, hands clenched behind him, which told Takase the man believed in rules the way other people believed in luck. They started the car-by-car check from the rear, moving forward against the motion. Morita walking with Takase now, quiet but alert, eyes flicking to details most folks missed, like scuffed floor mats and half-drunk teacups cooling too fast, while Takase watched people more than objects, because bodies lied slower. An elderly porter bowed too deeply when asked about the undercarriage. A married couple avoided each other's eyes too carefully, and the military officer finally stood, boots heavy, asking sharp questions about procedure, not the missing man, which told Takase exactly what kind of attention Kurosawa had been under. They checked lavatories, baggage racks, staff compartments, even the tiny pantry where the stewardess brewed tea, and everything came back clean, boring, normal, which was the problem, because disappearances don't happen in normal places. They happen in gaps. People stop seeing, and Takase kept circling back to the vestibule. That narrow strip of metal everyone treated like a hallway instead of what it really was. A joint, a seam, a place where systems flex. Morita mentioned, almost offhand, that the train slowed earlier, just a little, the way it always did on the incline before the long straight, and Takase nodded, filing it away, while the conductor insisted it didn't count as a stop, voice tight, jaw locked, like the distinction mattered more than the man. They questioned the drunk journalist again, sobered now by attention, who swore he heard pacing, not running, not struggling, just back and forth steps, like someone thinking hard, and that fit Kurosawa too well to ignore. Takase checked his watch, then Kurosawa's last recorded sighting, then the smoking schedule. Morita rattled off without looking at notes, and the timing lined up too neatly, like a plan tested in advance. And that's when Takase finally allowed himself a small breath, because the math was working. Which meant this wasn't chaos, it was design. He leaned close to Morita and asked her what felt wrong. not what looked wrong, and she hesitated. Then said the simplest thing, that Kurosawa hadn't been acting like a man stepping out for air. He'd been acting like someone stepping into work. And as the train thundered on, sealed, orderly, proud of its rules, Takase realized those same rules were probably the only reason Kurosawa was still alive. The vestibule looked smaller the second time, like it had shrunk now that everyone knew something was wrong, and Takase felt that familiar pressure in his chest that came when a space refused to explain itself. So he went at it, slow and thorough, blocking the doorway with his body while the conductor tried not to hover, and Morita stood off to the side, eyes sharp, hands loose now instead of clenched, because fear had turned into focus. Takase checked the outer doors again, palms flat against the cold metal, feeling the vibration of the train running through it. Steady and honest. Locks untouched, frost unbroken. No scratches where someone might have panicked. And that ruled out the easy answer, which annoyed a few passengers watching from the corridor, who clearly wanted something dramatic, like a jump or a fight, anything loud enough to be done with. He knelt and examined the floor more carefully this time, noticing how the grime told a story. Boot marks from staff, shallow scuffs from nervous pacing, one deeper heel print where someone had stopped and turned, and that matched the journalist's story too well to ignore. Morita pointed to the ash again, how it hadn't scattered as much, meaning the door hadn't been opened wide since it was dropped, and Takase nodded, because airflow never lies, and neither does dirt when you ask it the right way. He tapped along the panel seams with his knuckle, listening for hollows, counting beats under the roar of the wheels. And one section rang back just a shade duller, nothing obvious, nothing a normal inspector would flag, but enough to make Takase pause, head tilted like he was listening to a bad note in good music. The porter shuffled closer then, pretending to tidy, eyes flicking down and away, and Takase clocked it immediately, the way guilt sits in the shoulders before it ever reaches the mouth. But he didn't push, not yet, because people talk more when they think you missed something. Instead, he asked Morita to walk through exactly how Kurosawa stepped out, where he stood, how long he lingered. And as she spoke, Takase replayed it against the space, imagining a man not trapped but waiting, counting seconds, feeling the train slow just enough to matter, and that idea fit better than fear ever had. When the conductor finally asked the question, everyone was thinking, so where could he go? Takase didn't answer right away, just looked at the empty vestibule, the locked doors, the rushing snow beyond, and said quietly that the wrong question wasn't where Kurosawa went, but how long the train had been carrying him without knowing it, and the silence that followed told him everyone else felt it too. That uncomfortable sense that the empty space between cars wasn't empty at all. The next thing Takase checked was the thing everyone swore would have saved them, the emergency systems, because if Kurosawa had panicked, if he'd slipped, if anything had gone wrong, someone should have pulled a handle or kicked a panel, and the fact that nobody did was louder than shouting. So Takase walked the length of the car with the conductor, stopping at every alarm box, every brake lever, every glass case still clean and uncracked. While Hayashi kept insisting this meant the disappearance had to be impossible, his voice rising a little each time, like volume might fix logic. Morita trailed behind, watching passengers instead of hardware, and Takase caught her eyes narrowing when she noticed how people leaned away from the red alarm signs, like they were dangerous animals. Because no one wanted to be the reason the train stopped. Not out here. Not with military eyes watching and schedules carved in stone. Takase tested one alarm himself, just enough to feel resistance, just enough to know it hadn't been touched recently, and that sealed it. Kurosawa hadn't been surprised, hadn't been scared, hadn't needed help, which meant whatever he did it calmly, deliberately, with time to think. The military officer finally stepped in then, asking if sabotage was being considered. Tone smooth but heavy, and Takase answered honestly that sabotage left fingerprints, and this had left none so far. Just absence, which made the officer's jaw tighten in a way Takase filed away for later. They returned to Kurosawa's seat and found it exactly as he'd left it. Coat folded, hat resting on top, document case gone. But the wrist chain still looped neatly around the armrest like he'd slipped out of it on purpose. And that small courtesy hit Morita harder than anything else, her mouth tightening, as if the man had just excused himself from dinner instead of vanishing. Takase imagined Kurosawa doing it slowly, unhooking the chain, placing it carefully, choosing not to take the case into the vestibule where it would attract eyes, and that choice alone told him Kurosawa wasn't running from danger. He was managing it. When Hayashi muttered that no one could leave the train without stopping it, Takase finally pushed back, saying trains slowed all the time, and rules didn't notice small things. People did, and even then only if they were looking. The journalist overheard and scoffed that slowing wasn't stopping, but Takase met his eyes and said it only took a moment of lightness, a moment when weight shifted and sound covered sound, and that shut him up. By the time they finished checking the alarms, the brakes, the seals, Takase felt the shape of the trick forming, not the answer yet, but its outline, and it was clear now that Kurosawa hadn't beaten the train by force or luck. He'd beaten it by trusting it to behave exactly the way it always did. No alarm, no brake, just motion carrying a man where no one thought to look. By the time they decided to check the outside, the idea had already spread through the cars like a bad rumor that Kurosawa must have jumped. And Takase hated that kind of answer, the kind that felt done just because it scared people enough to stop thinking. But rules were rules, so the conductor slowed the train as much as the line allowed and ordered the rear observation shutters opened for a look. Cold air rushed in hard, snapping coats and biting skin, and snow filled everything. Thick and restless, flattening the world into a white blur that erased distance and depth, and Takase leaned out carefully, gripping the rail, eyes scanning the track behind them for any sign of disturbance, any break, any dark shape where a body might have landed. But there was nothing, just clean snow already smoothing itself over, like the ground didn't care what stories people told. The porter swore that if a man fell, you'd see it. Broken snow, dragged marks, something. And Takase agreed. Because physics didn't get polite just because it was cold, and Morita stood beside him, face pale but steady, saying quietly that even if someone had jumped, the sound would have been wrong. Too loud, too sharp, and someone would have reacted. And she was right, because panic spreads faster than silence. The journalist kept insisting the snow would hide anything given enough time, but Takase cut him off, pointing out they were talking minutes, not hours, and snow didn't work miracles that fast. Not under a moving train. He watched the military officer then, noting how the man's gaze stayed on the train itself, not the ground, like he understood something the others didn't, and that confirmed Takase's growing suspicion that the outside was a distraction, a convenient dead end people liked because it felt final. When they closed the shutters again, the warmth came back too slowly, and Takase noticed how the conductor wiped his hands over and over, more nervous now. Because the snow had refused to cooperate with the story he wanted, and back inside, The absence felt heavier than before. Not tragic, but deliberate, like a chair pulled back neatly after dinner. Takase walked the length of the car alone for a moment, listening to the train's rhythm change as it picked up speed again, thinking about weight, balance, and timing, and the way machines forgive small trespasses if you respect their habits. And by the time he rejoined Morita, he said it out loud at last, not as a theory, but as a boundary. No one went into the snow, because the snow had nothing to say, and that meant the only place left to look was the one everyone kept walking through without seeing, the train itself, carrying its secret forward through the night. Once the snow theory died, the train got louder in a different way, not with sound, but with stories. Everyone suddenly remembering something they hadn't thought worth mentioning before. So Takase did what he always did next. He listened, one passenger at a time, not letting them talk to each other, because memory behaves better when it's alone. The drunk journalist went first, sober now and sweating, swearing he'd heard footsteps pacing back and forth near the vestibule, slow and steady, like someone thinking through a problem, not scared, not rushed. And Takase believed him because lies tend to overperform, and this one didn't. A middle-aged woman said she smelled smoke stronger than usual, sharp and medicinal, not cheap tobacco. And Morita nodded because she'd noticed it too, but hadn't trusted herself to say it out loud. A young couple claimed they heard metal shift underfoot, a dull clunk under the rails. But they brushed it off at the time because trains make noise, and no one wants to be the person who panics over nothing. Takase watched their bodies while they talked, the way shoulders crept up, how hands kept busy, how eyes searched his face for permission to stop, and he let them, because pressure makes people defensive, and he needed them loose. The military officer spoke last, choosing his words like they cost money, saying only that Kurosawa had been under observation and that disappearance complicated things, which was the closest thing to honesty Takase expected from him, and it confirmed what Takase already suspected, that Kurosawa hadn't vanished randomly. He'd vanished on schedule. Morita surprised everyone by stepping in then, calmly listing who had walked past Kurosawa's seat that night, and when, her memory clean and exact. And Takase saw the conductor flinch, because staff weren't supposed to matter that much. Piece by piece, a picture formed, not of a struggle or a fall, but of a man buying time, using routine as cover, letting people half see him so they'd fill in the rest themselves. When Takase finally stepped back into the corridor, the train felt different, heavier somehow, full of eyes and half-truths, and he realized the danger now wasn't that Kurosawa was gone, but that everyone believed they'd already seen enough to explain it, which was always when the real answer got trampled. And as Morita walked beside him again, quieter but steady, Takase knew the next step wasn't asking what people saw, but figuring out what they all looked straight at and still missed. By now the train felt like it was holding its breath, every passenger quieter, every movement careful, as if noise itself might make the mystery worse. And Takase decided it was time to stop chasing stories and start chasing mechanisms, because doors don't lie even when people do. He and Morita focused on every door connected to the vestibule, the sliding inner doors, the service panels, the maintenance hatches that conductors insisted were sealed and irrelevant, and Takase made them prove it. One by one, watching closely as Hayashi unlocked each panel with stiff hands, his confidence thinning every time a lock opened too smoothly, like it hadn't been touched in years. The vestibule door itself was the real problem, because it showed no sign of being forced, no fresh scratches, no bent metal, and the latch slid like it always had, clean and honest, which meant Kurosawa hadn't fought it, hadn't rushed it, hadn't done anything loud enough to matter. And Takase kept coming back to that idea. Quiet work leaves clean results. Morita crouched low again, this time near the base of the doorframe, pointing out something so small most people would have missed it. A thin line of dust disturbed near the hinge, not dragged away but pressed down. Like weight had shifted there briefly, and Takase felt that familiar spark of satisfaction, because dust was a better witness than most humans. He asked Hayashi when the last full inspection of this car had been done, and the answer came too fast, rehearsed, which told Takase the truth lived somewhere nearby, but not in that sentence. They moved beneath the door next, Takase lying flat on the cold floor, despite the looks he got, peering under the metal lip with a small inspection mirror, checking shadows, bolts, anything that didn't line up with the blueprints he carried folded in his coat. And what he saw wasn't dramatic. No hidden tunnel, no open gap, but something worse, something subtle, a slight variation in panel spacing that suggested modification, old and forgotten, the kind of thing done quietly years ago and never removed. Morita watched his face instead of the floor, reading the shift in his expression before he said anything, and when he finally stood, brushing dust from his sleeves, he asked her what she knew about old train designs. And she admitted she'd heard stories from senior staff about wartime retrofits and temporary fixes that never made it into manuals, things meant to save time, not lives. That was enough for Takase to stop pretending this was just a disappearance and start treating it like an intentional exploit. Because Kurosawa hadn't broken the rules, he'd slipped through the cracks between versions of them. They tested the door again, opening and closing it, timing the sound against the rhythm of the rails. And Takase smiled faintly when he realized how easily noise disappeared under motion, how a careful person could do quite a lot without anyone hearing a thing. The conductor protested that no one could fit through anything beneath the door, not without tools, not without stopping the train. But Takase countered calmly that doors were built for people standing up, not for people willing to crawl, and the room went quiet at that, because the image was uncomfortable. Morita broke the silence by saying something simple and sharp, that Kurosawa had worn gloves, which meant fingerprints were never going to help, and Takase nodded, because it fit too well. The kind of detail you don't fake unless you've thought everything through. By the end of the inspection, they hadn't found Kurosawa, but they'd found something just as important, a place where the train's certainty thinned, where never opened didn't mean never used. And as Takase walked away from the door that insisted on its innocence, he knew the disappearance had officially moved from impossible to inevitable. The missing briefcase finally pulled the whole mess into focus, because people can disappear by accident, but objects usually don't, and Takase made everyone step back while he studied Kurosawa's seat like it was a crime scene instead of a place to rest, noticing how the leather cushion still held a shallow dent, how the wrist chain lay neatly looped around the armrest with no twist or strain, which meant it had been removed calmly, not yanked free. And Morita watched closely as Takase lifted the chain with 2 fingers, weighing it like he might feel the ghost of the case still hanging there. The conductor insisted the case must have gone into the vestibule with Kurosawa, but Takase shook his head, because anyone trying to stay unnoticed wouldn't carry something heavy and obvious into a narrow space where eyes lingered, especially not a man who already felt watched. Takase asked Morita when she'd last seen the case, and she answered immediately, before departure, tucked close to Kurosawa's leg, never placed on the rack, never out of reach. And that told Takase the case mattered more than the man's comfort, which usually meant documents, not money. They searched nearby luggage racks anyway, out of formality more than hope, and found nothing but coats, blankets, and the quiet resentment of passengers who didn't like their belongings. Touched, and through it all, Takase kept thinking about weight. Not just physical, but mental. How Kurosawa had been carrying something that made him pace, smoke, and plan. The military officer finally lost patience and demanded to know if Takase suspected espionage. And Takase answered that he suspected fear, which was far more common and far more dangerous. And that shut the man up in a way rank never could. Morita pointed out something else then, small but sharp, that Kurosawa's seat was one of the few close to a service panel beneath the floor. A detail she knew because she'd bumped her foot on it earlier during cleaning, and Takase's eyes lit up, because proximity mattered when you planned to move fast and quiet. He crouched again, pressing his palm flat to the floor, feeling vibration change slightly near the panel. Not enough to feel wrong, just enough to feel different. And he imagined Kurosawa timing his movements to that hum, using the train's own noise as cover. The porter hovered nearby, clearing his throat too often. And Takase caught it this time, turning to ask gently whether anyone had ever stored items beneath the floor during long runs, and the old man hesitated just long enough to answer honestly that they used to, years ago, before inspections tightened, which was all Takase needed. When he stood back up, brushing dust from his knees, the case felt less like a missing object and more like a signpost, pointing not to where Kurosawa went, but to how prepared he'd been. Because you don't leave behind something valuable unless you've already decided what's worth more. And as the train pushed deeper into the night, Takase knew the briefcase wasn't lost. It was waiting, just like the man who'd planned his disappearance, down to the last ounce of weight. Once Takase accepted that Kurosawa hadn't vanished but relocated, the train changed shape in his mind, no longer a straight line of cars but a stack of layers, some official, some forgotten, and he asked for blueprints, not because he trusted them, but because he wanted to see what they didn't show. The conductor produced folded diagrams with a proud little cough, pointing out compartments and systems like a man reciting family history. And Takase nodded along, while quietly tracking the blank areas, the margins where nothing was labeled because nothing was supposed to be there. Morita leaned in too, finger hovering over the paper, noticing a narrow gap between the vestibule floor and the undercarriage line, a space marked only with a thin dotted note about maintenance access, and when she asked what that meant, the conductor shrugged and said it was outdated, unused, sealed long ago. Which was exactly the wrong answer to give a man like Takase. They went looking for the porter next, the elderly one with the careful bow and the eyes that slid away from questions, and found him near the rear car pretending to polish metal that was already clean, his hands moving on habit alone. Takase didn't accuse him, didn't even mention Kurosawa at first, just asked how trains were built back when this line first opened, and the old man relaxed without meaning to. Shoulders dropping as he talked about rushed expansions, about fixes meant to last a year that lasted decades, about crawl spaces used by workers during winter repairs, narrow and miserable but passable if you knew where to press your weight. Morita watched closely as the porter realized, too late, what he was admitting, his mouth tightening, words slowing, and Takase stepped in gently, saying no one was in trouble yet, but someone might be in danger if they kept pretending the map was complete. The porter finally nodded, eyes down, and told them there was a service crawl beneath the vestibule floor, never meant for passengers, sealed with panels that looked permanent unless you knew which bolts turned and which didn't, And that information landed heavy, not because it solved everything, but because it solved enough. Takase asked if a man could fit, and the porter said yes, barely, if he wasn't carrying much, if he knew the timing, if the train slowed just right. And Morita felt a chill that had nothing to do with snow, because all of that sounded less like chance and more like rehearsal, when the conductor protested that this space wasn't on any official record. Takase answered calmly that reality didn't need permission to exist, and that line shut the conversation down. As they moved toward the vestibule again, this time with purpose, Takase felt the puzzle tightening, pieces sliding into place, not with a snap, but with a quiet, almost respectful click. Because Kurosawa hadn't escaped the train by force or bravery, he'd escaped by knowing it better than it knew itself, slipping into a space no one bothered to remember. A place not on the map, but very much there, carrying him forward in silence. By the time they reached the vestibule again, the train felt different to Takase, less like a machine, and more like a building that had grown careless with age, layers piled on layers until even the people running it only knew the top floor, and he could see the discomfort on the conductor's face as that truth settled in. Hayashi kept insisting the blueprints were official, approved, final, but Takase spread them out anyway on the small fold-down table near the wall, smoothing the creases with his palm, lining them up with the porter's quiet corrections, and the gaps started to line up too neatly to ignore. The porter pointed with a trembling finger, not to what was drawn, but to what had been erased over the years. Pencil marks once scrubbed clean, notes simplified, spaces sealed on paper long before they were ever sealed in steel. And Morita watched the man's mouth tighten as he admitted what everyone in maintenance knew, but never said out loud. That trains were changed in a hurry back then, modified during expansion, during shortages, during winters when freezing lines mattered more than documentation. Takase asked how often inspections checked beneath the vestibule floor, and Hayashi hesitated just long enough to answer honestly, which was almost never, because nothing was supposed to be there. And checking nothing felt like wasted effort. Takase let that sink in, then asked the porter how long it would take to loosen the right bolts if you knew which ones were false, and the old man swallowed before saying, maybe a minute, maybe less, if the train covered the sound, and Morita felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping through the metal. Takase traced the path with his finger, from the vestibule down into the crawl space, forward beneath the car, toward a maintenance ladder used only during long stops. And when he looked up, the porter was already shaking his head, saying no one was supposed to use that ladder while the train was moving, which told Takase exactly who had, because rules always exist for someone. Hayashi's voice cracked then, asking why no one had ever reported this, and the porter answered softly that no one wanted to be the man who delayed a train over a problem that didn't officially exist, and that quiet honesty landed heavier than any accusation. Morita glanced at Takase, realizing that Kurosawa hadn't just known about the space. He'd known about the silence around it, about the way institutions protect themselves by forgetting inconvenient truths. Takase folded the blueprints back up, not satisfied, but convinced, because the picture was clear now, not in details but in shape. And as the train surged forward into deeper night, he understood that this case wasn't about breaking rules at all. It was about trusting that the oldest lies were the ones written into systems, not spoken aloud, and Kurosawa had slipped right through one of them. Takase waited for the right moment to talk about speed, because speed was a touchy subject on a night express where pride rode just as hard as passengers. But eventually, he asked the engineer, not accusing, just curious, about the incline they'd crossed earlier, and the man answered the way professionals do, with exact numbers and no drama, explaining how the train always eased up there. Not a stop, never a stop, just a brief lightness as power shifted and the rails stopped fighting back so hard. Takase nodded like he was filing it away for later, then asked Morita to walk him through the timing again, minute by minute. And as she spoke, calm and steady, he mapped it against the engineer's words, the pacing footsteps, the ash on the floor, the door that never complained, and suddenly the gap wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a window. He explained it out loud then, not the whole trick, just the principle, that machines have habits, and anyone who studies them long enough can borrow those habits without being noticed. And the conductor stiffened, because that meant the train hadn't failed. It had performed exactly as expected. Takase asked the porter how long the slowdown lasted, and the old man said maybe 20 seconds, maybe 30, long enough to adjust footing if you were ready, long enough to move downward instead of outward. And Morita felt her stomach tighten at the thought of someone timing their breath to steel and snow. The military officer finally broke his silence, asking sharply if Takase was suggesting Kurosawa planned the whole thing in advance, and Takase answered yes, without hesitation, because nothing else fit, because panic doesn't measure seconds, and fear doesn't test bolts. He described how Kurosawa would have waited in the vestibule, calm on the outside, heart probably racing, counting the rhythm in his bones, then moving the instant the train lightened, slipping beneath the floor where sound dissolved into motion. And for a moment no one spoke, because the image was too clear, too human. Morita asked the question no one else wanted to, about what happened after. And Takase said that depended on how well Kurosawa knew the train, because getting inside the crawl space was only half the job. Surviving it was the rest. The engineer muttered that no one should try that. That it was insane, and Takase agreed, because insane plans usually left damage behind, and this one hadn't. Not a scratch, not a bent panel, not even panic, just absence. As the train pushed on, speed steady again, Takase felt the case narrowing, the chaos burning off, leaving behind something sharp and deliberate. And he realized that the disappearance hadn't happened during the slowdown at all. It had been completed there, quietly, efficiently. In a moment, the train itself barely noticed. Takase waited for the right moment to talk about speed, because speed was a touchy subject on a night express where pride rode just as hard as passengers. But eventually, he asked the engineer, not accusing, just curious, about the incline they'd crossed earlier, and the man answered the way professionals do, with exact numbers and no drama, explaining how the train always eased up there. Not a stop, never a stop, just a brief lightness as power shifted and the rails stopped fighting back so hard. Takase nodded like he was filing it away for later, then asked Morita to walk him through the timing again, minute by minute. And as she spoke, calm and steady, he mapped it against the engineer's words, the pacing footsteps, the ash on the floor, the door that never complained, and suddenly the gap wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a window. He explained it out loud then, not the whole trick, just the principle, that machines have habits, and anyone who studies them long enough can borrow those habits without being noticed. And the conductor stiffened, because that meant the train hadn't failed. It had performed exactly as expected. Takase asked the porter how long the slowdown lasted, and the old man said maybe 20 seconds, maybe 30, long enough to adjust footing if you were ready, long enough to move downward instead of outward. And Morita felt her stomach tighten at the thought of someone timing their breath to steel and snow. The military officer finally broke his silence, asking sharply if Takase was suggesting Kurosawa planned the whole thing in advance, and Takase answered yes, without hesitation, because nothing else fit, because panic doesn't measure seconds, and fear doesn't test bolts. He described how Kurosawa would have waited in the vestibule, calm on the outside, heart probably racing, counting the rhythm in his bones, then moving the instant the train lightened, slipping beneath the floor where sound dissolved into motion. And for a moment no one spoke, because the image was too clear, too human. Morita asked the question no one else wanted to, about what happened after. And Takase said that depended on how well Kurosawa knew the train, because getting inside the crawl space was only half the job. Surviving it was the rest. The engineer muttered that no one should try that. That it was insane, and Takase agreed, because insane plans usually left damage behind, and this one hadn't. Not a scratch, not a bent panel, not even panic, just absence. As the train pushed on, speed steady again, Takase felt the case narrowing, the chaos burning off, leaving behind something sharp and deliberate. And he realized that the disappearance hadn't happened during the slowdown at all. It had been completed there, quietly, efficiently. In a moment, the train itself barely noticed. Takase didn't announce what he was looking for next, because by now he knew answers came easier when people weren't bracing themselves. So he just asked Goro the porter to walk him through the end-of-line checks, the boring ones no passenger ever thinks about. And as they moved toward the rear service car, the air changed, colder, sharper, the kind that smelled like snow even before you saw it. Morita followed close, noticing how Goro's steps slowed without him realizing it, how his shoulders crept upward like he was remembering something he'd rather forget. And when Takase casually asked about emergency ladders, the old man stopped walking altogether, eyes fixed on a blank patch of wall, which was answer enough. The ladder was hidden behind a sliding metal panel, its handle worn smooth from use that officially didn't exist. And when Goro finally opened it, the hinges barely made a sound, too well oiled for something that was supposedly never touched. And Takase felt the last piece of the shape click into place. The ladder dropped downward at a shallow angle, disappearing into shadow, not meant for passengers, not meant for emergencies mid-journey, but perfectly placed for someone who knew the train's body like a map instead of a rule book. And Morita leaned forward just enough to feel the cold breath rising from below, imagining Kurosawa lowering himself there while the train thundered on, heart steady, hands careful, counting not courage but timing. Goro confessed then, voice rough, that years ago a supervisor had ordered the ladder installed during a rushed refit, something about border routes and contingencies no one explained, and afterward they were told to forget it, to treat it like a rumor, because trains ran better when people believed they were simpler than they really were. Takase listened without judgment, because he wasn't here to punish silence, only to understand it. And he asked the engineer how often the train slowed near the river crossing before the long forest stretch. And when the man answered, Morita felt that same cold certainty return, the kind that leaves no room for coincidence. Takase explained it gently now. The whole path from vestibule to crawl space to ladder. Not as a trick, but as a sequence of choices, each one risky but reasonable, if you believed staying visible was more dangerous than disappearing. And the conductor finally sat down hard on a crate, rubbing his face, like the truth weighed more than the train ever had. Morita asked the question that lingered in the air, where the ladder led, and Goro answered that it opened near a maintenance access, beside the embankment, hidden by brush, a place no one watched because nothing was supposed to happen there. And Takase nodded, because nothing ever happens in places people refuse to imagine. As the panel slid shut again, Morita saw guilt in Goro's eyes, but also relief, like he'd finally set down a burden he'd been carrying since before this night began. And Takase placed a hand on the cold metal one last time, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. Because Kurosawa hadn't beaten the train, he'd understood it, and that understanding was always more dangerous than force. The train roared on into the dark, steady and proud, unaware that one of its quietest features had just spoken louder than any whistle. By the time the train finally slowed for its dawn approach, the storm had burned itself out, leaving the world washed clean and pale, and Takase stood near the rear window, watching the snow-thinned fields slide past, thinking not about how Kurosawa disappeared anymore, but about why, because honkaku logic always ended there, at motive shaped by circumstance, not spectacle. The pieces were all aligned now, the timing of the slowdown, the hidden crawl space, the unused ladder, the maintenance exit swallowed by brush. And yet Takase didn't feel triumph, only a quiet pressure in his chest, because this wasn't a crime born of greed or thrill. It was a retreat, carefully planned, almost polite. Morita joined him, holding a cup of cooling tea, and asked softly if they would report everything, every bolt and ladder and silence. And Takase didn't answer right away. Watching a group of early workers along the trackside who had no idea how close they'd been to sharing a legend instead of a mourning, he explained then, slowly, that Kurosawa had known exactly what kind of train this was. A night express built on routine and trust, staffed by people trained to assume continuity, and that he had used those assumptions the way a chess player uses an opening, not to attack, but to escape the board. Kurosawa had stepped out to smoke, not because he needed air, but because he needed witnesses, people who could later say, honestly, that he'd been there, alive, calm, unafraid, and when he returned inside, he didn't rush, didn't act strange, because panic would have been remembered. But calm dissolves into the background. Takase imagined him waiting in the vestibule, counting the rhythm of the rails, feeling the slight change in gravity as the train eased on the incline, and choosing that moment not out of desperation, but out of certainty, because certainty is quieter than fear. Morita asked if Kurosawa would survive the drop from the ladder exit, and Takase said yes, because the embankment there sloped gently, because Kurosawa had chosen a place where the train slowed and the land forgave mistakes, and because the absence of blood or damage told them he'd walked away, not fallen. The conductor approached then, face drawn but steadier than before, asking what Takase planned to tell the authorities waiting at the station, and Takase said the truth, but not all of it, that a passenger vanished during the night, that no crime scene was found, that mechanical inspection was advised, and that no evidence suggested foul play by staff or guests. The conductor hesitated, then nodded, understanding without being told that trains, like people, survive by not exposing every weakness. Morita struggled with that, her jaw tight, asking if that was justice, and Takase answered honestly that justice wasn't a single shape, that sometimes it was a courtroom, and sometimes it was allowing a man to stop running without turning him into an example. He told her that Kurosawa wasn't erasing himself out of malice, but out of fear of becoming a tool for forces that didn't care whether he lived clean or broken, and disappearing was the only move left that belonged entirely to him. When the train finally came to a full stop, the platform quiet and bright with early light. Morita watched passengers disembark, stretching, yawning, already turning the night into a story they'd half forget by evening, and she realized that Kurosawa would become a rumor instead of a man, a question instead of a body. And that was exactly what he wanted. Takase stepped down last, feeling the solid ground under his feet, and for a moment he imagined Kurosawa somewhere far from the tracks, shedding his coat, his name, his careful posture, and breathing without counting seconds. Morita asked if they would ever know where he went, and Takase smiled faintly, saying that a perfect disappearance doesn't end with an answer, it ends with balance. And as the sun rose fully over the station roof, turning steel and snow into something almost gentle, Takase knew the case was closed, not because everything was exposed, but because nothing more needed to be taken from the man who chose to vanish.